Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty interesting subject, one that's been kind of shrouded in mystery and speculation for quite some time now. The origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. You've shared a report with us that claims that the German intelligence agency, the BND, believes that the virus may have originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. So this should be a pretty fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
We're looking at excerpts from a German media report alleging that the BND had evidence pointing to a lab leak as the likely cause as early as 2020. And what's maybe even more intriguing is that both the Merkel and Scholz administrations reportedly knew about this intelligence but chose to keep it classified.
This report certainly throws a wrench into the dominant narrative surrounding the origins of the pandemic. It raises some pretty big questions. What evidence did the BND have? How did they get it? And why would these German governments choose to keep it a secret? It's a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces for sure.
Yeah, so let's try to start putting this puzzle together. The BND report, at its core, asserts that a lab leak in Wuhan is the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, and they even went so far as to assign a probability of 80 to 95% to this theory. That's a pretty bold claim, wouldn't you say?
That level of confidence from an intelligence agency like the BND is definitely significant. It suggests they had access to, some pretty compelling evidence, although the report itself doesn't really delve into specifics. That's, one of the biggest questions we're left with, like what exactly was this evidence based on?
Well, the report does mention that German agents operating in China under a project codename Project Saaremaa gathered some pretty interesting data back in 2020. This included measurements of coronaviruses, scientific studies, and even unpublished dissertations from 2019 and 2020, all pointing towards the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Project Saaremaa itself raises a lot of questions, too. What were the aims of this project? What methods did these German agents use to gather information within China? It really suggests a level of clandestine activity and access to potentially sensitive information that we just don't really have a full picture of yet.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating to think about these German agents operating undercover in China, trying to gather intel on this emerging virus. It sounds like something out of a spy movie.
Yeah.
The report also mentions concerns about safety protocols at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It suggests that the virus escaping accidentally was a real possibility due to lapses in safety procedures.
Those concerns about lab safety protocols really add another layer to this whole story.
Yeah.
If the BND's suspicions are correct, it raises those bigger questions about the oversight and regulation of this kind of research, particularly research that involves, potentially dangerous pathogens.
Yeah, and here's the real kicker. Despite all of this, the German government, under both Merkel and Scholz, decided to keep this information classified. The report suggests that they were worried about the diplomatic fallout with China, and also maybe the potential embarrassment of looking foolish if the lab leak theory was ultimately proven wrong.
I think those are understandable concerns. Accusing another nation, especially a powerful one like China, of accidentally releasing a virus that caused a global pandemic, that's a huge step. It could have major implications for international relations, for economic ties, even for global stability.
It makes you wonder what kind of information governments might be holding back and what factors play into those decisions. Like, shouldn't the public be informed about potential threats to their health and well-being, especially considering the enormous global impact of the pandemic and all the restrictions that were imposed on citizens during that time?
That's a really crucial point you're raising there about the balance between national security and the public's right to know. Governments are often faced with really difficult choices about what information to share and what to withhold, weighing potential risks and benefits. I think in a situation like this, where a global pandemic has caused so much suffering and disruption, the arguments for transparency become even more compelling.
And it seems like the German government may have eventually felt that pressure too, because the report states that in late 2024, the Scholz administration actually allowed the BND to share its findings, but only with the CIA and a select group of scientists under really strict confidentiality. It seems like they were kind of testing the waters a little bit.
That's an interesting development, isn't it? It suggests a shift in the German government's approach, perhaps indicating that they felt like the benefits of sharing this information outweighed the risks of keeping it a secret.
Yeah.
It also raises the question of why they chose to share it with the CIA specifically and, what their objectives were in doing so.
Yeah, the scientists involved in those confidential meetings were virologist Christian Drosten. You might remember him. He had a very prominent role in Germany's pandemic response.
Right.
And RKI had Lars Schade, according to the report. The purpose of these meetings was to identify any weaknesses in the BND's argument for a lab leak. It's almost as if they were trying to poke holes in their own intelligence.
That is a very curious detail, and it speaks to just how complex the situation really is. Why would the German government, after keeping this information classified for so long, then try to actively challenge their own intelligence findings? It suggests a degree of internal debate and, maybe even skepticism within the government itself.
Well, let's talk about Drosten's involvement in all this. In a January 2025 interview, he was discussing the origins of the virus, and he stated that he still believed that a natural origin was more likely, but he also acknowledged that definitive proof was lacking for both the natural and lab origin theories. And he used a really interesting phrase, I think this, annehmen heißt aber nicht wissen, which means to assume does not mean to know.
Drosten's statement there really reflects, I think, an important aspect of the scientific process. It highlights the distinction between assumptions, even those based on, the prevailing scientific thought and actual knowledge that's supported by concrete evidence. He's basically acknowledging that while a natural origin might seem more likely based on our current understanding, it's not a certainty.
Right. And what I think is really interesting is that Drosten also went on to say that Chinese scientists actually had the capability to prove a natural origin, but they haven't done so. He even went so far as to speculate that maybe the Chinese government was preventing them from conducting the necessary research.
That's a pretty significant statement coming from a scientist of Drosten's stature.
Yeah.
His skepticism, I think, reflects a growing unease among some in the scientific community about the lack of transparency from China regarding the early days of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
The limited access to crucial data and to key sites has really fueled suspicions and made it really difficult to fully investigate the origins of this virus.
So we have this intriguing report from the BND based on their intelligence gathering, but we still don't have all the specifics of their evidence. And then we have Drosten, a leading virologist, voicing his own doubts about the natural origin theory, but acknowledging the need for more concrete proof. It's a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces, and it's hard to know for sure what the full picture actually looks like.
It's definitely a very complex and evolving story. I think it's likely that we'll see more information emerge, in the months and years to come that could potentially shift our understanding of what actually happened. This situation really underscores the importance of scientific integrity, open communication, and international collaboration when it comes to facing global health threats.
Yeah, we've explored a lot already, but there's one more piece of this puzzle that I think we need to examine, and that's the controversial gain-of-function research that was being conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Yeah.
This is where I think things get really interesting.
Yeah, indeed, gain-of-function research where scientists are deliberately making viruses more dangerous in a lab setting to study, their potential for causing harm. It's been a subject of really intense debate for many years. Proponents argue that it's essential for understanding how viruses might evolve and for developing vaccines and treatments to counter them. But critics warn about the risks involved, especially the risk of an accidental release.
And that's exactly the type of research that the BND report raises concerns about in relation to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right?
That's right. The report highlights those concerns about the, potential lax safety protocols and suggests that a lab leak potentially involving a virus that had been modified through gain-of-function research could have been the source of the pandemic.
So we have the BND suspecting a lab leak evidence of this risky gain-of-function research at that very lab, and the German government initially choosing to keep all of this information secret. It's quite the tangled web that we're unraveling here.
It certainly is, and it raises a whole host of questions about accountability, about transparency, about the potential dangers of this cutting-edge scientific research. If the BND's suspicions are correct, this isn't just a matter of scientific curiosity, it's a matter of global health security.
Let's take a moment to just absorb all of this before we continue this deep dive. Is proving to be as complex as it is fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. Before we go any further, I think it's worth kind of unpacking this whole gain-of-function research thing a little bit more. I mean, it's a topic that sparks some pretty strong opinions on both sides, and for good reason, I guess. The idea of scientists intentionally making viruses more dangerous, it can feel kind of unsettling, even if the goal is to better understand and combat, these potential threats.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. I can see why people would be concerned about it. On the one hand, you can see the potential benefits, right? Like you're trying to figure out how these viruses could evolve to become more, contagious or deadly so you can develop better vaccines and treatments. It's almost like, trying to predict the moves of a really dangerous opponent before they even make them.
Right.
But on the other hand, the risk of something going wrong, accidentally unleashing a pandemic or something just feels incredibly high.
Yeah.
It's kind of like playing with fire, isn't it?
It is. It's a very delicate balancing act for sure, weighing the potential benefits of the knowledge gained against the potential consequences of that knowledge. And in the case of gain-of-function research, obviously the stakes are incredibly high, and the scientific community has been grappling with these ethical and safety concerns for years now.
The BND report specifically mentioned concerns about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Do we know, like, what kind of gain-of-function research they were doing there? Was it focused specifically on coronaviruses?
Well, the specifics of the research that was being conducted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology aren't fully public, but we do know that they were studying bat coronaviruses, and there have been reports suggesting that they were engaged in these gain-of-function experiments to try to understand the potential for these viruses to spill over into humans.
Which is especially relevant considering what happened with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah.
Right? If they were already studying bat coronaviruses and manipulating them in a lab environment, it seems like something that warrants further investigation.
Oh, absolutely. Understanding the exact nature of the research that was taking place at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, I think, is absolutely crucial for, ultimately piecing together this puzzle of how the pandemic actually began. But unfortunately, the lack of transparency from China has made it really difficult to get a clear picture of what was going on there.
You mentioned earlier that gain-of-function research has been kind of a subject of debate for quite a while now.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key arguments for and against this type of research?
Well, proponents of gain-of-function research often argue that it's absolutely necessary to stay ahead of these potential pandemic threats that are out there by understanding how viruses can evolve to become more transmissible or more deadly. They believe that we can develop more effective vaccines and treatments. It's kind of like they say, it's like training our immune systems for a fight before the fight even begins.
Right. That makes sense. But it still seems so risky.
Yeah.
What if one of these enhanced viruses accidentally escapes from the lab?
That's exactly the concern that critics of gain-of-function research bring up. They argue that the risks of an accidental release, however unintentional it might be, are just simply too high. Mm-hmm. They point to, the potential for a global catastrophe like the pandemic we've all just experienced, and they question whether the potential benefits of this research really outweigh those risks.
It doesn't sound like there's an easy answer. It's one of the really complex issues with valid points on both sides.
It is, and the debate surrounding gain-of-function research has definitely intensified. I think in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, there are a lot of people calling for stricter regulations, increased oversight, and some are even calling for, a complete ban on this kind of research altogether.
Given what the BND is saying and the potential risks involved, it seems like the scientific community needs to have a really serious conversation about whether the benefits of gain-of-function research truly outweigh the risks. It's not just a conversation that needs to happen in one country. It needs to happen on a global scale with full transparency and open dialogue.
I completely agree. Open communication and collaboration are absolutely essential, especially when we're talking about something as potentially dangerous as this type of research. We need to make sure that any research that is conducted in this area is done with, the utmost care and with incredibly robust safety protocols in place to try to minimize that risk of an accidental release.
This kind of brings us back to the German government's decision to initially keep the BND's findings a secret. I get that they might have been worried about, causing problems with China diplomatically, but withholding information like this, even temporarily, it has implications that go way beyond just international relations.
Yeah, that's a good point. It raises really important questions about public trust and accountability. In a democratic society, citizens have a right to know about potential threats to their health and safety. And when governments withhold information like this, especially information that could impact public health, it erodes that trust and it fuels all kinds of speculation and conspiracy theories.
It's not just about transparency. It's also about, giving people the ability to make informed decisions about their own lives if we're kept in the dark about potential risks. How can we make informed choices about our own health and safety or advocate for policies that protect us?
Exactly. Informed consent and public participation are essential pillars of a functioning democracy, and those are completely undermined when critical information is withheld from the public. The COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted how crucial transparency and open communication are during a public health crisis.
Thinking back to that phrase that Drosten used, annehmen heißt aber nichts wissen. To assume does not mean to know. It seems very relevant here, too. We can't just assume that governments will always act in the best interests of the public or that they'll always be completely transparent with information. We need to be actively engaged, asking questions and demanding accountability from our leaders.
You're absolutely right. This isn't just about, figuring out where the pandemic came from. It's about the much broader relationship between government, scientific research, and the public. We need to be vigilant about ensuring transparency, ethical conduct, and public accountability, especially when we're dealing with issues that have a direct impact on our health and our well-being.
This deep dive has definitely highlighted just how complex the web of factors at play here really is. We have these alleged lab leaks, we have secret intelligence gathering, controversial research, and a lack of transparency from certain actors. It can feel kind of overwhelming to even try to sort through it all.
It's undeniably complex. There's no doubt about that. And it's important to remember that this is still an unfolding story. New information could come out at any time, and we need to be open to adjusting our understanding as new evidence comes to light. But even with all of this uncertainty, I think there's some really valuable lessons to be learned from all of this.
What are some of the key takeaways that you think listeners should be considering as we kind of continue this exploration?
Well, I think this whole situation really emphasizes the importance of scientific integrity and transparency. The pursuit of knowledge should always be coupled with a really strong sense of responsibility and ethical considerations, especially when you're dealing with research that could be potentially dangerous. Open communication, data sharing, and international collaboration are all crucial, I think, for building trust and making sure that science is ultimately serving the best interests of humanity.
Those are really important points. We've seen how a lack of transparency can erode trust and actually hinder progress. It seems like a recipe for disaster, especially when you're dealing with global health threats.
Exactly. And this situation also underscores the need for really robust international cooperation when it comes to addressing these kinds of threats. No single country can tackle a pandemic on its own. We need to work together, share information and resources and expertise, and really coordinate our efforts to effectively prevent and respond to future outbreaks.
It's a reminder that we're all connected in this increasingly globalized world, and our responses to challenges like pandemics, they need to reflect that interconnectedness.
Absolutely. And I think, finally, this whole deep dive serves as a really stark reminder of the importance of critical thinking and media literacy, especially in this day and age where there's so much information and misinformation flying around. We need to carefully evaluate our sources, consider multiple perspectives, and be wary of sensationalized claims and be willing to change our minds as new evidence emerges.
It's easy to get swept up in, the headlines and the drama and all that, but it's crucial to approach these complex issues with a discerning eye and a critical mind. We need to be informed and engaged citizens who can participate in these conversations and hold those in power accountable for their actions.
You've hit the nail on the head. This deep dive has taken us really deep into the world of espionage, scientific research, government secrecy, and the global implications of this pandemic. It's been a journey full of twists and turns, and we're not quite finished yet.
I'm really curious to see where this deep dive takes us next. I feel like there's still so much to unpack, and I have a feeling there might be more surprises in store for us.
So you mentioned that this is sort of an unfolding story, right? Like what aspects of this whole thing should we be paying attention to as things develop? What could potentially, change our understanding of how this pandemic started even further?
Well, there are a few key areas that I think are worth watching really closely. First of all, any further evidence that might emerge from intelligence agencies, whether it's from the BND or the CIA or other agencies around the world, that could shed more light on what was actually happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in those early days of the outbreak. Yeah, it makes you wonder what else is out there, right? Like what's hidden in classified files and government archives. It's like we're living in a real life spy thriller, except, the stakes are so much higher.
Exactly. And then secondly, the scientific community is they're continuing to do research into the origins of the virus. So new studies, analyzing viral genomes, looking at animal populations, investigating the early epidemiology of the outbreak. All of these things could provide really crucial insights.
So it's kind of like a race against time almost, right? Like to uncover the truth, because the more time that passes, the harder it might be to really figure out what happened, back in those early months when this all started.
That's a really valid concern for sure. Memories fade, evidence can get lost or corrupted, political pressures can influence, how information is shared and all of that. But despite those challenges, I think it's essential that we continue to pursue the truth, both so that we can, understand the past, but also so we can hopefully be better prepared for future pandemics.
Well, speaking of the future, you mentioned earlier the kind of international implications of all of this. Like if this lab leak theory starts to gain more traction, how could that affect relationships between countries, especially between China and the West?
Well, if a lab leak were to be definitively proven, I think it could have a really huge impact on the geopolitical landscape. It could lead to increased tensions, accusations of negligence or cover-ups, demands for accountability, and it could also damage trust in international scientific collaborations, which would make it even more difficult to address these kinds of global challenges in the future.
I mean, the relationship between China and the West is already pretty tense right now. This could really make things even worse, couldn't it?
Yeah, it definitely has the potential to kind of pour gasoline on an already existing fire. I think, the pandemic has already put a strain on global relationships, and the question of its origins just adds another layer of complexity to all of that. And it highlights the need for, really careful diplomacy, transparency, and a real commitment to making decisions based on evidence if we're going to navigate these really sensitive issues.
It's a good reminder that, global health issues are never just about health. They're also about politics and economics and power dynamics and trust and all of these things that play out on an international scale.
Exactly. And it also underscores the importance of building, strong global institutions and frameworks for cooperation, particularly when it comes to things like pandemic preparedness and response. If we're going to be able to effectively address future global health threats, we need to find ways to work together despite our differences.
It's a reminder that we're all connected in this world. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects that touch every single nation.
Absolutely. And it also, I think, highlights the importance of individual responsibility. We all have a role to play in preventing future pandemics, from, practicing good hygiene to supporting responsible scientific research to advocating for policies that promote global health security.
It's actually really empowering to think about, that even in the face of these huge global challenges, our individual actions can still make a difference. It makes me feel a bit more hopeful that we can actually learn from all of this and create a safer and healthier future for everyone.
I share that hope with you. I think this deep dive has really been a journey into the depths of scientific uncertainty and political intrigue and ethical dilemmas. It's a story that's definitely not over yet, and I think it'll continue to shape our understanding of the world for many years to come.
It's been fascinating and thought-provoking, to say the least, I know.
Yeah.
I'll be following this story closely and thinking about the implications for science, for global health, for international relations.
And I encourage everyone listening to do the same. Stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions, because we've only just begun to scratch the surface of this incredibly complex issue.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's been a wild ride. Until next time, keep exploring the depths of knowledge.